A man hijacked a plane for $200,000, then opened the door of that plane while it was still in the air and vanished into the night. And more than 50 years later, no one knows who he was. No body, no trace. Just an empty space left behind in the American sky. On a stormy night just before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man took $200,000 in cash, walked to the back of a Boeing 727 flying thousands of feet above the ground, lowered the rear staircase, and jumped straight into the darkness as if he knew exactly what was waiting for him below. But the most terrifying part is this. No one ever saw him again. No body, no signal, no clear sign that he ever made it to the ground. Just a hole left in the sky, and a question that has lasted for more than half a century. On the surface, this looks like a simple hijacking. A man claims he has a bomb, takes the ransom, and escapes. But the deeper you look, the more the story starts to feel like a paradox. Because everything Cooper did was both incredibly precise and completely irrational. As if two different men were living inside the same plan, one cold enough to calculate every detail, and one reckless enough to bet his life on a jump that almost no one should have survived. That night on Northwest Orient Flight 305, 36 passengers boarded, expecting nothing more than a short trip before the holiday. They had no idea that just minutes later, the entire space around them would be controlled by a stranger. And the only thing separating them from disaster was his terrifying calm. A calm that made everything look normal, when in reality, nothing was normal anymore. Cooper did not look dangerous. He looked ordinary. He sat near the back, ordered a bourbon and soda, lit a cigarette, watched. No rush, no scene, no sign that he was about to do anything unusual. And that normalcy became the perfect disguise, because no one suspects the man who looks like everyone else. Then he handed flight attendant Florence Schaffner a note. A tiny act, something easy to ignore, but the way he told her to read it immediately changed the air inside the cabin. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten her. There was just a certainty in the way he spoke. As if he already knew that from this moment on, everything was in his hands. The note was short, cold, emotionless. He had a bomb in his briefcase, and he wanted her to sit beside him. No extra explanation, no attempt at drama, just a fact, and a wait for the reaction. And in that moment, the entire flight began to slip away from its normal course. But strangely, no one in the cabin realized it right away, because everything happened in silence, as if danger was there, but made no sound. Cooper demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. No more, no less. A number large enough to matter, but reasonable enough to be delivered fast. And while the plane circled above Seattle waiting for the ransom, he stayed exactly the same. Smoking, talking, watching. No signs of fear, no signs of pressure, as if failure never crossed his mind, or as if failure was never part of the equation. But this is where the first real question begins to form. If he was that prepared, if he understood control that well, then why didn't the small details fit? Why did he leave behind cigarette butts, a strand of hair, a clip-on tie? Things a truly careful man would never leave behind. And if he was smart enough to exploit the unique structure of a Boeing 727, then why was the escape plan so vague? Fly to Mexico. No drop zone, no precise route, no sign of a clear logistical plan waiting for him on the ground. When the plane finally landed in Seattle after more than 3.5 hours in the air, the atmosphere inside had completely changed. But still, no screaming, no panic, just a heavy silence. The kind that settles in when people slowly realize they have been close to something dangerous. And the most disturbing part? They had not understood it when it was happening. Cooper took the money and the parachutes. Every movement was precise. No rushing, no hesitation, no awkwardness, as if he had done this before. Then he released all the passengers. And somehow that decision made the whole thing even harder to understand. Because if control was the goal, why give up the biggest advantage he had? Why lower the pressure on himself when the plan was still unfinished? The plane was refueled and took off again. This time, only the crew and Cooper remained. The cockpit door closed. And from that moment on, everything that happened behind that door became a blind zone. No one saw it directly. Everything had to be reconstructed from what was left behind. Cooper said he wanted to head toward Mexico, but he gave no detailed instructions. And throughout the flight, he stayed alone in the back, with the briefcase that supposedly held a bomb, 4 parachutes, and $200,000 in cash. And that's when the story starts to change. Until then, everything had been about control. Now, it became about risk. Because no matter who he was, and no matter how much he had prepared the moment he left, that airplane was the moment everything moved beyond control. Completely. In the middle of the night. In the rain, in the wind, with the engines roaring around him, Cooper lowered the rear staircase, an act that even many pilots at the time had never imagined. And then, he disappeared. No signal, no call, no emergency sign, just a sudden absence, as if he had never been on that flight at all. In the middle of the night, in the rain and wind, with the sound of the engine surrounding him, Cooper lowered the rear staircase, something even many pilots at the time had never imagined. And then he disappeared, leaving behind no signal, no call, no sign of distress, just a sudden void, as if he had never existed on that flight at all. And this is where the story begins to split in two. When one side believes Cooper was a genius, a man who planned everything perfectly and escaped, while the other colder theory suggests he died that very night, swallowed by the weather and the altitude. But if he died, where is the body? Where is the parachute? Why is there no trace at all? And if he lived, why did no one ever see that money surface? Why was no one ever caught using bills with recorded serial numbers? The FBI launched an investigation that lasted for decades, following thousands of leads and examining more than 800 suspects. And every time they thought they were getting closer to the truth, one small detail would collapse the entire theory. Names like Richard McCoy Jr., who carried out a nearly identical hijacking just months later, Sheridan Peterson, who understood the Boeing 727 Robert Rackstraw with a complex past, or Kenneth Christensen, who once worked for the very airline that was hijacked. All of them had reasons to be suspected, but none were enough to prove anything, as if Cooper always remained just outside the reach of certainty. And when everything began to feel like speculation, physical evidence became the last hope. The items he left behind, on the plain cigarette butts, a strand of hair, and most importantly, a clip-on tie. A small detail, but one that held more information than anything else. When analyzed more deeply, the tie contained more than 100,000 microscopic particles, including rare metals like bismuth and pure titanium materials, not commonly found in everyday life, but present in specialized industrial environments, opening a new possibility that Cooper was not a random criminal, but someone who had worked in a high-tech setting, someone who understood machinery systems, and most importantly, how to exploit their weaknesses. But just as the story began to take shape, and another detail shattered it. In 1980, an 8-year-old boy found $5,800 in decaying cash, buried along the Columbia River, with serial numbers matching Cooper's ransom. And this detail explained nothing. It only raised more questions. If the money was there, where was Cooper? Did the river carry it there, or did someone bury it? Why was only a small portion ever found? And where did the rest go? And more importantly, what does that say about his fate? This is the moment everything flips. Cooper is no longer the image of a perfect criminal, but becomes a question man who may have controlled the first half of his plan perfectly, but completely lost control of the ending. And that is what makes this case so haunting, because it may not be the story of a man who beat the system, but a man who outplayed it for a few hours and then was consumed by his own plan. So what really happened that night? A perfect escape, or an ending no one ever witnessed? How does a man move through every layer of control, manipulate an entire flight, and then vanish without leaving behind a clear ending? There was no trial for D.B. Cooper, no verdict, only a case that lasted more than 50 years and was officially closed by the FBI in 2016 without answers. And as of 2026, his identity remains unknown. His fate remains a void, and his true motive has never been confirmed. And maybe the most disturbing part is not what he did, but how he did it. A man who walked into a system that seemed impossible to break, understood its weaknesses, controlled it in silence, and then disappeared without an ending. Not like a legend, but like a flaw in the system that was never fixed. If you think this case is disturbing, there are darker ones you've never heard of. Cases where the truth stayed hidden for years, or was never found at all. Subscribe to Silent Case Files to uncover them.